If the Russians win, we get that confrontation with NATO. If Ukraine wins, though, again, remember, if there's one thing we understand about the Russians is they feel they have to get to the Danube and they have to get to the Vistula.
Yeah.
Well, that means if they get kicked out of Ukraine completely, they're just going to try again and again, as long as they can.
Well, they have Crimea. They're not going to let go of Crimea.
Well, if the Kerch Strait Bridge is destroyed, they will have to.
Russia is prepared for a new, more brutal invasion if Ukraine wins the war. That's the latest prediction from geopolitical expert and strategist Peter Zyyhan. When we think about wars, we usually hope that when one side wins, the fighting stops. However, in the case of the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, a Ukrainian victory might not mean the end of the troubles. Instead, it could set the stage for a new, even more aggressive Russian invasion. Ukraine and Russia have been at odds since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, a region that was part of Ukraine. This move by Russia was seen as illegal by much of the world, and it caused a lot of tension. The conflict escalated in 2022 when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, leading to a brutal war that lasted for more than a year. Despite facing a much larger and better equipped Russian military, Ukraine has put up a strong fight, with support from Western countries like the United States and members of the European Union. In an in-depth interview, geopolitical expert Peter Zyyhan reveals what could happen if Ukraine wins this war. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where we will discuss Peter's insight about the implications of Russia's possible defeat. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you enjoy economics, geopolitics, and history, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Now let's jump in with this interview with Peter Zyyhan.
That's how the Ukrainians were trained until very recently. It was only since the 2014 war that they started actually learning things like small unit combat. So what we trained them with after the Crimean conflict was how to operate in small groups, no more than 50, where initiative was with the local leaders as opposed to the generals back in Moscow. And you have to decide what your target is. You have to decide how to get that. You have to decide how to use different types of equipment. And those types of forces proved very successful against this static, stated Russian system in the counteroffensives last year. And that's what allowed them to, with a combination of drones and satellite recon and good targeting, to take back their territory in Donetsk and in Kherson. What we tried to school up the Ukrainians on for this year's counteroffensive was combined arms, where infantry is working hand in glove with armor, which is working hand in glove with artillery, which is hand in glove with helicopters, which is hand in glove with the Air Force. The idea that you can have a blitzkrieg style attack, go anywhere and be mobile about it and hit with everything that you have at your strongest point where they're weak. The problem is that combined arms requires an Air Force, and they don't have one. So in their first couple of attempts, they got their asses handed to them because the Russians proved to be able to put down a lot more mines than anyone ever thought was possible. You got to stop. You got to send in the zappers. You've got to do dig a hole, drop it in. You can also deliver them as bomblets from artillery. There are also vehicles that do it. And the Russians did layer after layer after layer after layer. And so the Ukrainians would come up against this and maybe break through the first couple of layers, but then you'd have a corridor and Russian artillery would start raining down. And since the Ukrainians didn't have air support, the only way they could fire back was with their own artillery, of which they had a lot fewer shells. So I don't want to say it set them up to fail, because that's not fair. But we taught them a good technique, but they didn't have the equipment to execute it at scale. So they had some tactical successes, but no big breakthrough. The Russians have had a very good year for harvest, so nobody in Russia is going to starve unless it's a distribution issue. Ukraine, despite having a couple of shitty years, one of the world's largest agricultural exporters, and even without the roughly 2 million square miles of agricultural land that is either under siege, Russian occupied, or mined, they still have more than enough to feed themselves. What they lack now is a sufficient volume to keep their exports up. Kiev's probably not the best comparison because it was the most service-led of the cities economically. And so as long as you don't have a power outage because of an air raid, I don't want to say life is going on normally, but the restaurants are open, people are going to work. There, the economy is more or less functional. As you move east and south, you're getting to more industrial lands. So like the Tver region, which is roughly south. That's the big industrial heartland. That's where their steel belt is. The problem is that it gets most of its electricity from that nuclear power plant that you keep hearing about is shut down, and it gets most of its coal from areas that are now mined. So basically, the value-add economy, the materials value-add economy in Ukraine is basically stopped. They would have no problem doing it. And if you look at Kharkiv on the northeast, it took immense damage in the first year of the war because it was an artillery range. There's no best case scenario. If the Russians win, we get that confrontation with NATO. If Ukraine wins, though, again, remember, if there's one thing we understand about the Russians is they feel they have to get to the Danube and they have to get to the Vistula.
Yeah.
Well, that means if they get kicked out of Ukraine completely, they're just going to try again and again, as long as they can. If the Kerch Strait Bridge is destroyed, they will have to. We don't have good census information on Crimea because since the first attack on the Kerch Bridge back in, about a year ago now, there's only 3 rail lines into Crimea. One is the bridge, and that one's been destroyed. The other 2 go within missile range of the front. One goes within artillery range of the front. So people, if they can get out, they're getting out. We don't know how many people are left in Crimea. We also know that it has a Turkic minority that is furious at the Russians. So, there's definitely a fifth column in there if it comes to that. But if the Kerch goes down completely, then the Russians will have no choice to evacuate Crimea because they can't support it. They can't get stuff in. It would be a massacre of a scale we have not yet seen in this war.
When we talk about Ukraine winning the war, we're talking about them being able to push Russian forces out of their territory, including Crimea, and restoring their country's borders to what they were before 2014. This would be a huge victory for Ukraine and a big defeat for Russia. But that's where things get complicated. Western countries have given huge support to Ukraine during the current conflict, providing weapons, training, and financial aid. However, if Ukraine wins and Russia prepares for another invasion, the West might need to rethink its strategy. There are a few reasons why a Ukrainian victory could lead to another invasion by Russia. Russia is a major world power, and its leaders, especially President Vladimir Putin, don't want to appear weak. If Ukraine wins, it would be a massive blow to Russia's image, both at home and internationally. The Russian government might feel the need to reassert its strength to avoid looking weak, and that could mean planning another, even bigger invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, a defeat in Ukraine could cause unrest within Russia. People might start questioning Putin's leadership, especially since he has invested so much in this war. To distract from internal problems and maintain control, Putin might launch another invasion to rally the country around a common enemy. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence, a region it believes should be under its control. A Ukrainian victory would mean a loss of this influence, especially if Ukraine strengthens its ties with Western countries. Russia might not accept this loss and could invade again to try to bring Ukraine back under its control. Let's get back to Peter Zyyhan as he discusses this further.
If Ukraine wins everything, doesn't stop the war, just means there's a pause until the Russians feel they can try again. And so if the Ukrainians are going to prevent that, they have to cross into Russia proper, and they have to neutralize a couple of cities that serve as logistical hubs for the war. I think that anyone who gives you a time frame for how they think this is going to shake out is just making it up. Right. So many of our assumptions before the war, during the war, have been proven wrong, and the best we can do is kind of shine a light on when something matters and explain why. All of the dominant theories don't make sense to me. I don't see why the Russians would have done it because it was their primary leverage over Germany. I don't see why the Americans would have done it because if you remember back on the 1st of September, the Russians turned it off and publicly threatened the Germans. Like, look, without this pipeline, you don't have an industrialized economy anymore. So you have a choice to make. You either do it our way, you backstab NATO and Ukraine, and we'll turn the line back on and you can be modern. Or you keep doing what you're doing and the pipeline stays off, and you can be Western, but with an agrarian economy. And the Germans did. They chose to be Western, not modern. And so from the American point of view, when this threat was made, we thought we knew what the Germans were going to do. We thought they were going to side with the Russians, just like they had on every other energy and security issue of the last 25 years. So we were getting the hammer ready. And then all of a sudden, the Germans said, no more. That down. So there was no reason for the US to do it. Remember that there's bigger infrastructure crossing Ukraine that's still operational. The insanities of this war. If I was a betting man, my theory, which I can't support, but my theory is that it was Gazprom, the Russian company that operates the pipeline. Because when the Kremlin said no more gas for Germany, force majeure doesn't apply. You broke your contract. And so Gazprom is now on the hook for reimbursing the Germans for natural gas they had to buy on the spot market, which cost 5 times as much. So, you're talking $1 billion every few days. But if the pipeline were to blow up by forces unknown, well, then force majeure does kick in and you can walk away from the contract. That's just my personal theory. Germany, the oil to this point has not been a problem. Oil is a more or less fungible commodity, and as long as most of it is shipped by tanker, there are other options. They cost a little bit more, but it has not proven a deal killer. Oil is the black stuff, the liquid that you see in all the shows. You refine it into things like naphtha and gasoline and diesel, and that naphtha gets turned into things like plastics. So it's the primary industrial input for modern society, especially for transport fuels. Natural gas, oversimplifying here, is primarily used as an electricity generation fuel. It's also used to create a lot of chemicals that cannot be made another way. So when the natural gas line was cut off, because natural gas is a gas, it usually has to be piped. There was no alternative supply as there could be for liquid oil. So what the Germans had to do was 3 things. Number 1, de facto ration and shut down heat in a lot of public buildings, shut down a lot of their industrial capacity because the natural gas that they could get now cost too much. It was like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times as much.
So now, let's break down Peter Zyyhan's insights about this potential new invasion from Russia. While a Ukrainian victory might seem like a cause for celebration, it could also trigger a new, more aggressive invasion by Russia. This scenario would create enormous risks, not just for Ukraine but for the entire world. It's essential for Ukraine and its allies to be prepared for this possibility and to work together to prevent it from happening. This might mean strengthening Ukraine's defenses, increasing economic pressure on Russia, and using diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful resolution. However, the road ahead is uncertain, and the possibility of renewed conflict remains a significant concern. In the end, the situation between Ukraine and Russia is unpredictable, and while a victory for Ukraine would be a huge achievement, it could also lead to further challenges. It's important to remember that in international conflicts, victories don't always mean the end of the fighting, and sometimes they can even lead to new and more dangerous battles. What do you think of these developments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe for more updates and analysis as we track the most important global issues.